I'm the director of a think tank, Center for Data Innovation, that really focuses on how data is changing so much in our society, how we use it, how it can be used to improve the economy, how it can be used to improve quality of life for individuals, and really thinking about how public policy can support some of this data-driven innovation that we're seeing in society. Obviously, right now, the biggest example of this is artificial intelligence and the way that AI is just revolutionizing, pretty much every sector. It's changing how we do things in our day-to-day life. And all of the AI models that are being created are really being created because of this massive access to data. But it's not just AI, right? It's also the Internet of Things, it's data analytics, it's big data, cloud computing, all these technologies that come together that allow us to do more with data. And they've also really fundamentally changed how organizations operate. Most organizations are what you would, if you look at organizational theory, most organizations are designed to process information. They have to process information about sales, HR, suppliers, all sorts of things, and they function to get information from one source to another. The CEO needs to understand what's going on in the environment. The accountant needs to understand the finances. The salesperson needs to understand information about the clients and the products. But we're now facing organizations that have to deal with just massive amounts of information, new sources of information, and there's a lot of changes that go into effect because of that. So I was asked to talk about some of the IP implications of big data and what's changed here. And so I kind of want to make a few points here. So first of all, when we think about data, right? So data for most organizations, it's an incredibly valuable asset. It's something that historically was unique to an organization. Nobody else had that data. That was often something that was of intrinsic value, and they wanted to use that data to do something unique. Maybe it was they had exclusive data about their customers. Maybe they had exclusive data about a particular business process or method. But they wanted to use that data to create some kind of value. The difference that we've seen in terms of the rise of big data and where we are today with the data economy is that in the past, the scope of data that organizations dealt with was fairly narrow. It was smaller and discrete. Maybe there was certain databases that they held that was fairly small. Could be held in a server. I mean, you had mainframes, but even those were relatively small in size. And now what's changed is that we're dealing with the world of big data. So big data is the 3 V's, right? It's volume, velocity, and what's the third one? Volume, velocity. Everyone here should know this one. Does anyone else know? I'm curious. It's been around for a while. That's why I thought other people would know. So volume, veracity, and I'm thinking someone's going to get it before I look. Variety. There's also veracity, which some people use, and I knew that wasn't the one I was trying to think of. But volume, veracity, variety, and so when you think about that, right? Volume is just the amount of data has radically changed, right? So we have just massive more amounts of data that's being collected. The velocity has to deal with the fact that we're dealing with, for example, real-time information that's coming in. We have a lot more data that's being collected by the Internet of Things, by connected devices, and so we have to think about how to process all that information in real time. And then the last part is variety. So it's data from lots of different sources. It's not just kind of these smaller databases that are about just a particular product or something. You're pulling in lots of different information. And so as part of that, there's many different data sources that now organizations are dealing with. And those data sources might be from different third parties, different organizations. So one question that comes up is ownership of data. It used to be the organization would own all its data, and there was really no question about IP rights and what you could do with it, because it was just your information. Now this has changed. You might not be able to actually attribute where the information is coming from. Then you also run into issues such as what happens when you make inferences from data sets that you've aggregated. Who owns those inferences? Is that owned by the original suppliers of the data, or should it be owned by this new entity? There's also questions around just what you can actually protect under existing intellectual property law. So when you think about copyright, copyright protects creative works. If you're thinking about data, especially kind of people will say raw data, a collection of facts, raw data you can't copyright in most countries. So there's questions there about how you can actually protect this. If you can't protect it through copyright, are you protecting it through trade secrets? Well, if you're protecting it through trade secrets means you can't necessarily share it with a third party. So how do you do data sharing if all your IP rights are tied up based on a trade secret model of protecting IP? So there's a number of issues that come up in that regard. Then you can also think about, the actual, in kind of the data science world, where do people spend most of their time? Well, it's in data cleaning. It's in taking data sets and preparing them for use in analytics. If a significant part of the investment that goes into creating valuable data sets is in data cleaning, well, that's just basic transformation. So again, that's not something you can necessarily copyright. So you get back to the same question about, well, then how are you protecting the intellectual property? How are you protecting the investments that companies are making into these data sets? So lots of, you can see how, data sharing can quickly become very complex in this kind of big data world. There's new, legal frameworks you have to figure out. You have to figure out how to govern the data. And then you have to think about, the various challenges here: data protection, privacy, accuracy of data sets. And then the last dimension that I want to mention is the global nature of this. So again, in the past you might just have all the data stored in a single organization. Now we're talking about sharing data across organizations, but now we're also talking about doing that across borders on a global level. When you start talking about doing this on a global level, you run into other challenges. So for example, different countries have different data protection laws. They have different IP laws. Working across all that complexity can be very challenging, especially if you're trying to protect, for example, personal information. You're trying to protect certain trade secrets. And so this has actually created just enormous challenges around the world for companies that are operating in this space. To kind of give a very concrete example of how this has changed, you can think about trade in trade in products. In the past, you would have restrictions on certain products might be prohibited in a country, or they'd have to go through certain tariffs, but they go through a customs process, right? Someone would inspect it, they'd allow the product in, or they wouldn't allow it in. Now we run into this situation where it's the data flows themselves that are actually what's being traded. Sometimes it's literally just data that people are buying and selling, but sometimes it's data that actually is a core part of a service. So for example, in orthodontia, one thing, the way they've changed how they do, how they move teeth. It used to be that you just have these wires on your teeth, and the orthodontist would put them in, and they'd figure out where your teeth should be, and they move them around that way. We've seen the use of these kind of 3D printed devices that you wear that move your teeth over time. It's based on a 3D image of a model of your mouth, but that's data, right? And so when there's been concern, when there's been conflict between countries about somebody selling a product that maybe they don't think is authorized, maybe it hasn't gone through the sufficient medical reviews, maybe there's fights over the various use of patents that was used to create that. Well, how do you actually prevent selling that service? You prevent it by preventing the flow of data, by restricting the sending of data about people's mouths. So there's been all sorts of kind of interesting conflicts that have arisen in this kind of big data world where now trade is not just about actual products, but it's about the trade in services here. Another dimension that comes up quite a bit is the difference between ownership and access when it comes to data. As I mentioned, kind of the traditional data world was you owned all your data. Now the question is, do you have access to information? Around the issue of access to information, this matters because when you owned it, you could make all the determinations: how it was used, how it could be analyzed, third-party uses, what could be inferred from it, and what others could do with it. But now many data sets have co-owners. And so we have to come up with new models for deciding how we govern these aggregated data sets and what can be done with them. So to give kind of some concrete examples, patient data. When you go to the doctor and data is collected about you, who owns that data? Should it be the patient or should it be the doctor? Doctors would say, it's the doctor's notes. It's their intellectual property that's being created. It's their analysis of the patient. As the patient, you might say, well, no, it's all about me. Well, I'm paying you to do this. It should all be my data. And so in many cases, we see that there's multiple interests involved here. The patient might say it's all of my data, but then, the doctor might say, well, but I'm conducting a study over multiple years based on my medical research, so I need to have access to that data. So you can see different conflicts there. Or you can think about ride-sharing apps, right? So you think about a ride-sharing app, you're doing it on your mobile device. There could be multiple kind of claimants to that data. You have the ride-sharing app itself that says, no, it's our app, so it's our data. You have the driver who says, no, I'm going these places, it's my data. You have the rider who says, no, it's about me, it's my personal data. You might have the mobile phone company who says, well, we're tracking all the devices, and so that's our data. Or then you even have now the vehicles sometimes, where the vehicles are collecting the data. So lots of different questions. And the reason these questions become very important, especially from a policy perspective, which is what I look at it from, is because deciding who has ownership or who has access can significantly impact how innovation occurs around this type of data. It could be that if you assign ownership in one place, that it means the data doesn't actually get to another place where there could be useful innovation. So for example, if you assigned exclusively patients to own all their data, that might mean we have less medical research and less medical innovation that's driven by patient data. So really interesting questions that I think we have to think about when we're designing products and services, but also when we're thinking about the policy that governs all of this. And then when you start, though, creating policy in this space, you have to start asking questions about, well, is the policy actually designed to maximize innovation, or is it designed to, protect some kind of incumbent interest? Because you could, geo-restrict data. You could say, for example, some countries say, data must be processed within our borders, which is, good if your goal is to maybe, boost a, building of domestic data centers, but it might be bad if your goal is to actually ensure that data can be put to the best use. So for example, many companies want to send their data overseas because there's some types of analytics, there's AI services that they're using abroad, maybe they have partners abroad, maybe they're just a multinational corporation, they're trying to share their data. So we run into various issues there. And so I've talked a lot about the challenges in this space, and I want to talk a little bit about some of the solutions. So we did some research recently that looked at basically asking this question about, if we want to build a global data commons or a national data commons, what are some of the ways that organizations are doing this? So if we look at data and we recognize that it's no longer that you can just say, to be successful or to innovate in this space, I'm going to collect all the data, but instead you have to say, I'm going to be aggregating a bunch of data, and I need to do this with partners. What are the models to do that, and how can we do that effectively? So one model is just kind of basic data sharing partnerships. So establishing contractual relationships between two or more parties to say that we're going to start sharing data, and these are the terms under which we're going to share it. Pretty straightforward. Kind of moving beyond that, we're seeing other models. So one is called data trust. So data trust is where you create a governance framework around a specific set of data that's going to be collected. And typically you involve some kind of intermediary who's going to be responsible for executing those rights and operating those rights. So for example, you might have a data trust around, for example, health data that's collected by a number of hospitals. They get together and they say, we're going to all agree that data collected for research around this type of cancer, this type of rare disease is all going to be shared under these certain conditions. And here's maybe even the specific data formats and standards that we're going to use to collect it. Then we're also seeing data consortiums, and data consortiums are being used quite a bit in industry. And this is where you have, again, kind of relevant stakeholders who come together and say, basically, we're all better off if we share data than if we don't share data. And so they come together and they create a reciprocal data sharing agreement, where if you put your data in, then you have access to everyone else's data. And so what's useful about that is it often creates a tipping point, where even if you don't get everyone to agree initially to share data, after you create the consortium, enough partners have joined that everyone who's not part of it realizes that they're actually worse off. And what's really interesting about that is it moves the kind of the innovation ecosystem quite a bit, because it moves you from a world where everyone's innovating based on the data they have to everyone's innovating based on the data everyone has. And so it's no longer about exclusive access to data, but about what you're actually doing with that information. So if you think about something like pharmaceutical research, a lot of you have various pharmaceutical companies all studying similar types of things. When you're developing drugs, you have many unsuccessful drug candidates. All of that research, all of that information is often held by a single company. And so other companies that are maybe doing similar research that would learn, this particular avenue is not going to be fruitful, or maybe something was successful, it wasn't successful for the type of treatment they were seeking over here, but be successful for something else. If they had access to that information, they could do much more. And so we're starting to see these types of arrangements where it's really changing then how these companies are innovating, and they're really focusing on moving faster and moving their capabilities. So it's no longer about just again kind of innovating with what they have, but really about changing their entire approach to doing drug discovery. Beyond that, another model that we're seeing is what's called a data cooperative. And so data cooperatives are a bottom-up way of collecting data, pooling data across many stakeholders. So an example that we've seen of this is among drivers that are in a particular ride-sharing app. They said that our data is valuable and we want to monetize it. And so they got together and they said, we're going to share, we're going to create this consortium or, this data pool. And by sharing it, then we're going to set all the rules by how others can gain access to it. And we're going to decide the way we want to monetize it. And then beyond this, we're also seeing, sometimes the issues are around privacy. People have issues of control. And so we're also seeing technical solutions that are being proposed. So things like federated learning, where the goal is to basically move the computing so you don't have to aggregate all the data into one spot and do all the processing on a single server. Instead, you leave the data where it is, and you can actually do decentralized data processing, or you can do things like homomorphic encryption, where you can encrypt the data so it's not revealed to third parties, but you can still do types of processing on it. These are ways to create, kind of technical solutions that work around the challenges that we see in terms of data sharing. But where is all this going? And that's where I want to really end here. As I said, AI has obviously changed a lot of the conversation around, the importance of data and why it's necessary. I think there's also growing recognition. A lot of people would say, data is the new gold, or data is the new oil. I think it's important that we recognize that, there are, while those expressions are useful in, illustrating that, data is obviously incredibly valuable, and it's a driver of the digital economy today. There are some very important differences between, data and these other types of commodities, principally being that data is non-rivalrous. So, if I have data and I share it with a third party, or I share it with multiple third parties, we all have access to that same data. My giving someone else the data doesn't diminish somebody else from using it. Unlike oil, where, you can only have one party. If I use that oil, nobody else is using that oil. If I use the gold, nobody else is using the gold. So that rivalrousness is important. So that's an important part. The other part is that, data is non-fungible. Right, so if you think about other types of things, one barrel of oil is pretty much the same as another barrel of oil. You can easily substitute the two. But there are, data sets that, this data is different than other data. And so you also want to make sure that you have access to the right data. And that's a big part of data policy, is figuring out how to actually create the high value data. And when we're looking at AI, this is actually where a lot of the innovation is occurring, is now in creating these high value data sets. So you can create really robust models that are highly efficient. One of the reasons we've seen so much innovation in the early days with some of these really large language models is, as people know, they were pulling just massive amounts of data, not just data sets of books that were published, but pretty much everything that was on the internet that they could scrape. Right, that was a big part of it. And the benefit of that is that these were highly capable models. They learned a lot, but they were also highly inefficient. If you looked at the amount of compute that went into building them, but also the amount of compute that's required to run a query, to run an inference on these systems, is quite high. Now we've seen a real effort, as companies like Microsoft and Google are trying to deploy these technologies, a real focus on efficiency. And when you look at doing more efficient large language models, there's different ways to approach it. One way is to prune these these large neural networks. Basically, look to see what parts can you cut off so that you can have a much smaller model that can be very efficient. And so when you've seen these models released, we often see kind of like the 70 billion parameter version and then the 2 billion parameter version. And the 2 billion parameter version is often, pretty accurate as well. What we've seen with some of the recent models, though, is they don't just prune them, they actually are creating them in a different way. And so, one of the original, papers that led to all these, large language models was attention is all you need. This idea that you can just, use these attention mechanisms to go through and build the models, and you can throw any kind of data you want at it, and that's all you need to do. Microsoft put out a paper. Microsoft researchers put out a paper earlier this year around some of their smaller large language models. And theirs was about experts are all you need, and they really showed how by using a much more curated set of data. So in this case, for example, they really went with peer-reviewed academic research and used that exclusively as their training data. They were able to create significantly smaller but equally high performative LLMs to use that are then much more efficient. You can run these basically on a cell phone today. So one of the areas we're seeing, in terms of what we're looking at going forward is basically this idea of how do we have these highly curated data sets, high quality data sets that allow us to create better AI models. A second issue we're running into is that AI models themselves are highly valuable, but it's actually hard to protect them using existing IP law. When you look at the model themselves, they're just made up of numerical values, right? It's not even data, it's not even facts at that point. It's just it's like a spreadsheet, and so we see that there's nothing kind of creative in the traditional sense defining that. So it's not protected under copyright law. It's protected under, again, trade secrets. So companies are very concerned about how they can actually maintain access to that, especially when there's a lot of regulatory proposals being put out there that say that they have to turn over their models to government regulators. And then there's concern that this IP can basically be stolen from them. There's also concerns, from the creator community in particular about the use of their works to train AI models, right? And this is where we see, even I think last week, there was a letter that went out, or a public statement that went out, signed by tens of thousands of artists, musicians, performing artists, arguing that it was fundamentally unfair for these models to train on their work. And here I think I disagree with that notion. I think artists are rightly trying to protect their rights. But historically, for example, if you're a cartoonist and you want to figure out how to draw cartoons, you might look at a bunch of Disney cartoons and practice in your own home drawing them and learn from that. Now you can't go out and sell a picture of Mickey Mouse unless you actually work for Disney, and that's where the IP law comes in. But you can learn from it. And I think that's where right now we're still in that, we have that question about, is this fair use? When you access publicly available, copyright protected content, but publicly available that anyone can see, can you train on it? And so far, I think most of the courts are coming down with the answer is yes. But policymakers are still wrestling with that thought and trying to figure out where they go next with that. I do think, though, that the focus should be, in terms of IP protections, how do we make sure that works produced by AI models, if they infringe on copyrights, that those rights are protected. I guess I'll end there. I'll just say that the last part that comes out is that we are seeing, as I said, some differences in how countries are approaching this. Certainly in some of the new proposals we've seen, some countries like Japan have been really kind of forward-looking and saying we want to make sure that anyone can train on publicly available data, and also trying to create clarity for industry that yes, you can do this. We've seen other countries, particularly in Europe and the UK as well, where we've actually seen delays where companies like Meta have said, we're not going to introduce our new AI models in these countries because of regulatory concerns around IP issues. And we've also seen, particularly in Europe, proposals to create new what they're calling text data mining rights, where basically you could have copyright owners have the ability to exclude their works from being trained or to charge for that right to train their works. So a lot of different proposals that are out there, and all of them that could really affect the trajectory of how this goes. So anyway, I'll pause there. As I said, I'm happy to kind of take questions, not only about this, but I work generally on tech policy, so also happy to go more broadly. Yes, please.
So my question is that data sets are usually being refined, right, by machine learning models.
Yes.
So what I'm curious is that even if we do solve the issue of ownership, then how would we be able to distinguish between refined data or like actual raw data and like infringement data? Like how do you label the data as such and determine what it is?
Right. Well, one point is, I think a lot of companies that are developing these models are trying to rely on synthetic data. So, AI created data as a substitute for copyright protected data, because it's basically a way to say, well, we know that this data we can train on. And I think that actually gets to kind of a bigger point, which is that there is increasingly a focus on responsible sourcing of data sets and thinking through how did we actually get it, and is it appropriate for the particular use that we have. And just like in other parts of the supply chain, there's been a lot of emphasis in that over time in improving the supply chain, for example, to make sure child labor is not being used in products, or making sure that unsafe chemicals or compounds aren't part of the product. There's a lot of work that has to go into actually doing that sourcing and then making sure that that information can be tracked throughout the life cycle of a product. I think that's what we're starting to see now. For the most part, if you look at the model cards that are released with the AI models, those that do that and that talk about their data sets, now some don't really reveal any information, but those that do, you start to see that they're all pretty much using the same data sets, right? There's only a few large data sets that most researchers are using. And what's interesting is most of those data sets weren't actually created for this purpose, right? They were created for traditionally other purposes. And I think that's where we're getting into this conversation about, okay, how do we actually create a valuable data commons that, so we can have data sets that are created for the purpose of training models, and then we don't run into that issue. Because right now, and that's the critique that we're seeing in a lot of these big lawsuits against OpenAI, for example, is that they don't actually know everything that's in the data sets that they use, because that wasn't what they were focused on. They just knew that this was the data set everyone was downloading, so that was the one they were going to download to. And so, yeah, being able to separate that out, I think, will be really important going forward. But how you do that long term is going to be a challenge. And what you I think want to avoid from the policy perspective is to put too much responsibility on companies to know everything about data sets when they're trusting a third party for it. It's like, on the internet, we have what's called intermediary liability, where a company like Facebook, they're not responsible for everything that somebody will upload because they can't possibly know what's up there about everything. And if you did make them responsible, then we wouldn't have user-generated content sites. I think that's the same challenge we have with training data. You can't know everything that was in the training data, so we can't put that full obligation on the companies. Yet at the same time, we want them to take some responsibility. And so that's where I think we're having to figure out how to draw those lines. And if you have any thoughts on that too, I'd also be really interested.
Yeah, no, I also was thinking about how if there was tracking on the data sets, but that is also a very difficult process, I would imagine. And also sometimes I also think about how, what if the data that's being feeded into machine learning models are just being generated, put online, and then once again in the machine learning model. So at what point do we know that the data is becoming redundant or unauthentic, basically? And how much of the data is changing? So you mentioned, I think the commons is a solution, like the data commons. And I think that's a good way in the sense that if people started early, they would probably be able to put that data in, authentic data into a place that we would know is authentic, seeping into other data. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, one of the, so if you look at some of the large language models that have been created recently, especially in multiple languages, you see that one of the reasons that they don't work as well in other languages is because, for example, there was one study that looked at the Chinese language of a couple of models, and most of the publicly available information in Chinese that these companies were scraping that was available was basically spam and adult content. And so the language that was being produced by it just wasn't accurate because it wasn't trained on something effective, or it was trained on government data. So it was very unlike how people actually would talk in day-to-day life. And so, yeah, kind of this really bad data sets. And then, now we're, to your point about more, basically more AI generated content that you're just kind of feeding back in. That is the risk, right? Because then you have people that are using, that they're creating more Chinese language websites using AI models that are based on poorly trained AI. So it's just creating more bad data to train on. The only, I think, positive news I think might break that cycle is there is a real emphasis right now in trying to figure out how to do what's called AI labeling or watermarking of output. That doesn't work as well for text, but it does work better for images, video, audio. And so, as we see more content being generated by these systems, they will be, I think, increasingly labeled. And also, that type of labeling can be done by creators themselves. So when an artist is publishing photographs, they can label that this is genuinely by this artist, and then when people are making decisions about what to train on, they'll have more information to make those decisions.
I actually have a second question as well.
Sure.
So you mentioned how different countries, they deal with data protection or data privacy laws differently. So do you think that there is an existing governing body that kind of deals with these kind of situations, or do you think there needs to be one? And if so, then the governing body, would it be like also in a way a commons, like a data commons, in the sense that maybe some countries agree to sharing data? Because I feel like data privacy is a really big concern now, right? I mean, we're using a lot of websites, we're using a lot of companies that take data from all across the world. So maybe a governing body would be more efficient in deciding how our data is used. Like, let's say we're sitting in Pakistan and we're providing this data and it's going to America. So maybe if there was an agreement between the countries, maybe that's a way that it can be more safer.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of work, I think, on creating these kind of interoperability frameworks. And so right now there's basically two broad approaches to doing this. And so one is basically data harmonization of these data protection rules. And that's what the GDPR tried to do within Europe. And then what the GDPR requires is what they call adequacy. So before you can send data from a European country to another country, it has to be deemed to have an adequate level of data protection. The problem with that is that to deem that another country has an adequate level of data protection basically means they have to adopt GDPR as well. So it's a way of kind of, is what they call the Brussels effect, spreading this policy on other countries. If everyone agreed that was the right data protection rule, that would be fine. But the problem is most countries don't all agree that that's the right rule. It's very expensive. It's costly for companies to comply. There's restrictions on how data can be used. Restrictions that impede, I think, data-driven innovation. So not every country does it. The alternative model is what's been developed through APEC, the cross-border. And it's now been taken out of APEC, so it's the Global Cross-Border Data Protection Rules, CBPR. And that allows, instead of harmonization rules, interoperability rules. So instead of saying that every country has to follow the same set of rules, instead it says all the countries need to agree to certain principles, and how they implement those principles can differ from country to country, and they can self-certify. And there's basically ways to allow countries to have their own ways of enforcing their data protection rules. For example, some have a data protection authority office, others might use the court system, others might use a data ombudsperson. There's all sorts of different mechanisms. But as long as they have these certain principles that they can enforce, then you can share data freely. And so that type of method, I think, is a little bit more flexible, and certainly allows data sharing. But again, then we start seeing, countries will implement, and we've seen this globally, we've done a couple studies on it, specific requirements that say data can't leave our borders for particular purposes. And that really impedes this type of innovation. It impedes, obviously, having access to the original data sometimes. Sometimes it impedes access to data processing. So I think, that's the challenge there. But I don't think we'll ever get to one set of rules for everyone. I don't think that's probably the right solution. But we do need to have better cooperation around these issues. And certainly, I think that's where these data sharing partnerships and frameworks can be really useful, because it recognizes that we're going to have to be pulling data from different types of organizations, different types of countries. But at the end of the day, we should be working together for these same issues, especially in areas like healthcare, the environment, where we have to share this data, because you can't do the analytics without that. Yes.
You talked about data privacy and how we can collaborate. However, I had a scenario in mind that I wanted to see how you would approach. Imagine you're leading a project where accessing data from key sources is essential for business insights. The data you need is protected by terms of service, strict anti-scraping technologies, and isn't available for purchase. Competitors who gain a significant market advantage by accessing similar data through questionable means refuse to collaborate, unwilling to lose their edge. While you've seen cases where competitors are open to data sharing partnerships, this group is particularly resistant. Given this high stakes environment, how would you approach obtaining the data you need, balancing the need for business growth with legal compliance, ethical considerations, and technological limitations?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I wrote a paper a couple of years ago called Blocked, and it was looking at almost that situation where there are certain data sets that certain parties are restricting access to, usually for their own economic interest. And sometimes, so I'll walk through a couple of examples to make it concrete for everyone. So one example we've seen is with banks. So in many cases, our financial information we have about our own bank accounts, we want to share that data maybe with a third party. Maybe we want to share it with an app that can help us manage our finances. Maybe we want to use it to help make payments. But it's our data. It's our financial data. But the bank says no. And the bank says no for a couple reasons. One reason is that if you can download all your information about your bank, you might see the different fees that they're charging you. And one of the things the app can do is tell you there's a bank that charges you fewer fees, so go to this other bank. And the bank really doesn't like that. The bank wants you to do all your banking through them directly. They want you to use their app, not a third-party app. And then, the bank also might have, maybe more legitimate interests. They might be concerned about protecting your security of your account. And they say if we are allowing a third party to access your information, that might compromise your privacy or security. And so they say no. And so what we've seen in those cases is that it's usually necessary for regulators to help set some guidelines. So there's open banking rules that have been created in a number of countries that basically lay out those requirements that say, customers have the right to access their data, and industry has to work together with different stakeholders to ensure they can do that in a way that is secure. And so they don't necessarily, put hard and fast rules on everything in terms of like the technical ways it must work, but they do set certain requirements. They say you can't deny consumers access to their data. You have to allow them to have access to a third party, and they set certain technical security requirements so that it's not compromised. So that's one example. Another example we saw was actually in the healthcare space. So in the healthcare space, we have a lot of companies that make these electronic health record systems. They'll sell it to large medical providers, hospitals, for example, but they're competing with each other. So you have one system that's selling to this hospital, another selling to this hospital, Now, if you're a patient and you go from one provider to another, you want your data to be able to easily transfer. But if you're a provider of those systems, you might say, well, we really don't want to do that because we'd rather either charge for that or we just want this other hospital to give up and buy our system so that, and so even though, for example, the US, there was a law that required them to share data, they would still put in place barriers. And eventually it took basically legal action to force them to go in. And again, this was basically a non-compliance issue. And the third example that I think is actually, it's very different, and I wanted to bring this one up, is around real estate listings. So real estate listings, people are selling their houses, and the way this is set up in the United States is very regional. So you might have a city or a state, all the listings go in this region's listing, and all the real estate agents that are selling, they have exclusive access to this data. Now, if you are creating a competitor to this that says, maybe as a buyer, I don't want to use a real estate agent. I just want to buy directly from the seller, which is what we do online now. People buy peer-to-peer. And so I want to cut out that middleman. Well, what the real estate agent said is nobody can have access to the listings of what houses are for sale except us. And they created all these different kind of laws and regulations and policies around that to restrict access to it. And they also did things like they restricted people from scraping the data. They restricted in terms of service. If you're an agent, you couldn't provide someone else, third party. So they really locked it down. And this was an area where we had to eventually come in with the Department of Justice actually came in and took kind of antitrust action against them. And so they started to kind of lessen the hold of these entities on that data. In all of these cases, there's basically some kind of entity that has an interest in restricting access to the information. And there's usually some kind of disruptor who says, I could do something better if I had access to this information. I could provide some kind of new service, but it would be kind of against whoever owns the data's interest. So I think for the disruptor, there's a few things they can do. One, they need to make a compelling case for the value they're adding. And sometimes they can scrape the data, even though it's against the terms of service. And it's one of these areas where it's a fight they just have to have. They're going to do it kind of in contravention of what the data owner says can be done. But it is, if they can publicly access it, they can usually scrape it. And so they can just do it. But sometimes you want to force them. And that's what happened, for example, with the banks. They forced them, but they also kind of negotiated sometimes. So you had a lot of apps that started saying, well, we're just pay the bank a little bit of money because it was easier for us to pay them. And once we paid them, then they provided us access. And then over time, we started changing the policy, so now they have to provide free access. But to initially innovate, they just had to pay. And then sometimes, I think it's really, you have to go to the policymakers and say, this is something that is kind of fundamentally broken here, and we need to fix it. And so, that's my general answer. I'd be curious if there's a specific situation you're also thinking about. And
so basically, I have a discount app, and we have a competitor in the market, which is holds a monopoly over the market, right?
Yeah.
So they have access to all the consumer data, right? And for us to get to that data, we have to build the data ourselves. So we have to get a user base, right? And get in customers and track their data ourselves. We can't really buy the data from them.
Yeah.
That's why I was asking Kate, how do you get the insights that your competitor has? Do you just scrape the data that is publicly available, or do you somehow negotiate with them and buy the data from them? Because obviously they're not going to sell to their competitors, right?
Right.
Because they're disruptors here, right? And we're standing against them. So it's not in their benefit to give us the data.
Right. Yeah. It's often looking for alternative sources of data, looking for partners if they're getting their data from a third party, then trying to figure out if you can get that data from the third party as well. One of the things I think is important. There are kind of antitrust arguments that are made sometimes saying that it's wrong for a certain party to have the exclusive access to data, but if they're not doing anything to restrict others from accessing it as well, they might not be selling it, but if they're not restricting others from also gathering it, they're not necessarily doing anything I think that's anti-competitive. It's just like if you have a company that, for example, hires all the best workers, or if you have a company that is just, you think about Starbucks, right? Starbucks that has all these coffee shops globally. They know a lot about coffee that nobody else knows about, and they have access to all that data. They don't necessarily have to sell that data to a competitor, even though a competitor would like that information, as long as they're not restricting, for example, Apple from, they're not telling Apple if you have the Starbucks app on your phone, you can't have another coffee shop's app. I mean, that would be anti-competitive. So I think we have to think about kind of where those lines are and how to draw them. But in general, I think it's going after figuring out where they're collecting their data, if you can get access that way, or sometimes looking for novel data sources. For example, if you can create an app for customers that are interested in discounts, well, sometimes you can crowdsource that data, and looking at those kind of alternative sources. Please.
So specifically speaking about data scraping, you talked about so many lawsuits that are coming into the courts specifically on data scraping. So there's two small questions. First is that shouldn't it be understandable that people are getting frustrated over data scraping when these companies that are scraping data are for profit, so they're not creating open source solutions.
Yeah.
And the second is that why do we see in terms of policy that these incidents happen, and then after a few years after the incidents have happened, there's actual policy that stops it? Because in terms of OpenAI or even Meta, the scraping was already done.
Yeah.
It had its effect on policy, on society and politics. And a few years after that, the government itself, not just in the US but in Europe, started to make clear policies on what was allowed and what wasn't. So why isn't the government really looking in the future and anticipating these kind of issues?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one of the interesting things about scraping is that I think most people thought it was resolved, that scraping was lawful and allowable in general. I mean, we had this debate 25 years ago with search engines, right, where search engines were also criticized. Why are you scraping the internet? And people said, well, is that fair? Is that a violation of copyright law? And there were lawsuits about that at the time, and they found that no. I mean, using that was considered, for example, under U.S. law, fair use, because it was creating something new. It wasn't competing with it, and there were very specific rulings that put certain restrictions. So, for example, you couldn't scrape all this and create a search engine, and then you could display a snippet, but you couldn't just display the entire website on your own without sending them to the website that you had scraped from. So I think that's where there was just an assumption that this issue had been resolved. And so with AI, I think policymakers are kind of revisiting and asking, well, has something changed here? And I think a lot of them are saying no. Some are saying yes, and that's why there's this question about, well, can we do more to allow the copyright owners to opt out? Beyond what's done already with like the robots.txt file, which allows you to say you don't want your website crawled, but to actually remove the data from the scrape site. I do think there is this kind of interesting question about also protecting our freedoms online. I think and those freedoms should, I think, include the freedom to innovate and the freedom to scrape. Like we want to say that if you can go to a website and you can download it through your browser, what's the difference between downloading to your browser and downloading it to an app or downloading it to an AI model that's going to learn from it? At some point, you have to be careful how you draw those lines. So, for example, if you said you can't scrape a website, one of the most useful tools right now that Google has released is this one that allows you to. It's basically a journal, right? You can put in articles and summarize it. Notebook LLM, and if you couldn't scrape, then you couldn't put in links and say, summarize this link for me, because that's what this thing is doing. And that would be highly inefficient for a user. You could hire someone, you could have an assistant who you could tell, go read this website and summarize it for me, but you couldn't tell an AI agent to do that for you. And I think we have to be very careful that we don't set up these kind of rules that really don't make sense in kind of a real world scenario. But obviously still thinking about, well, what are what are the different equities involved, and does this discourage, for example, people publishing things online if we go too far in a certain direction? Yeah.
So this might be a stupid question, but let's just say there's a company that holds monopoly over a certain market. Let's just say Pakistan.
Yeah.
And they're restricting access to data. Now, can you look at a similar market and you can get consumer behaviors data? And my question is, how accurate can that data be when compared to a similar market? Let's just say I get data from Bangladesh, and then based on that, I infer, okay, this is the consumer behavior in Bangladesh, and because Pakistan is also a third world country like Bangladesh, the consumer behavior in Pakistan will also be similar to the consumer behavior in Bangladesh.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the data and obviously the similarity of the consumer behavior. I mean, the reason the reason government data is so useful is it provides that real snapshot of what's happening on the ground, and then it allows you to take these other types of privately sourced data, kind of related data sets and do analytics and basically see, can you make legitimate inferences from them? But you would have to have some ground truth to start with to, I think, make that assessment. Otherwise, I mean, you could just make the assumption, but you wouldn't know for sure if it was accurate or not without something to back it up. I'm curious, is there a company in particular you're thinking of that has access?
So if you look at the UK's market, right, there's companies like uni days and student games that are being used on a daily basis by consumers. So it's a discounts app.
Yeah.
Right? And they have a lot of users. But in Pakistan, there's not really a trend of using discounts app. So I was thinking, okay, if people are using discounts app in the UK's market, why not in the Pakistani market?
Yeah.
There's so much inflation, right?
Right.
So I was saying, can we compare the two countries, and if so, on what basis, right? So again, your answer to the question was right. Okay, you need to have a solid reason to say, okay, we can infer this from the data because there's so and so similarity between the two countries.
Yeah, and you probably want to look at the similarities of the e-commerce markets themselves, right? Like the amount of the types of products that are purchased online, the demographics, and how similar that is as well, since that probably shifts between countries quite a bit. Yes.
So I have two questions. So first one is related to the pace of policymakers, or how they are adapting to the pace of how technology is growing. So we have seen the US government regulations around crypto and how the SEC is trying to regulate crypto, although everyone knows that this is something which will be used in future, and already some institutions like BlackRock and other institutions, they are already building their funds on blockchain and using this technology. And also these all the concerns related to data which we mentioned in this session, they can be easily tackled using NFTs and zero-knowledge proofs and ML. Even we might have already working on these use cases for the healthcare product they are using. So they are leveraging these technologies. So I think it's not on the technology side. There are solutions available, but the policymakers, they are really slow in adapting to this advancing technology, and they are the ones who are actually making these things real problems, like ownership of the data and traceability of the data and monetization of the data. These solutions are already implemented using this distributed ledger technology. So anyone who owns the data, you can easily trace that, monetize that, and then distribute that instantly from people who contribute. For example, there is a platform like Ocean Protocol which lets users to share your data, and then you can monetize that, and consumers like AI applications, they can use their data to train their AI agents. So everyone is good, users are contributing their data, they are getting incentives, and consumers are getting authentic user data in order to train their AI agents. So that is the first question, that why this space of policymaker is not actually, it's not compatible with the advancement of the technology. And the second question is slightly off the topic, but maybe it's relevant to the data that you are a representative of US government here in Pakistan, and when you see that Pakistan government is implementing these firewalls which are directly impacting the privacy of users and how our data is going, everything is being traced, and then they are having internet restrictions. How do you see that going forward, and what will be the stance of specifically US? I think you must be using Twitter with VPN here in Pakistan. Doesn't this look a bit odd and absurd to you that where these things are going in future for countries like Pakistan?
Yeah, so first I'll clarify, I'm not a representative of the U.S. government. So I'm obviously I'm deeply grateful for the consulate for helping organize my visit here today. But I'm with a nonprofit organization in the United States, so part of civil society. But I can still answer, reflect on that question, obviously, but just for clarity on that. So I'll start with the second one. I mean, I hadn't realized the restriction on Twitter until last night when I was trying to send a tweet out, and I realized I couldn't do it from my laptop in my hotel, but I could do it from my phone and the app, and I thought that was pretty bizarre. I had obviously seen some of the restrictions that have been coming up, and the need for VPNs, but also the requirements for registering VPNs, and all of that really I think gets to this fundamental issue that to be a leader in the digital economy, which I think Pakistan has this obviously really robust IT sector, and it's always it's been just globally recognized as this hub for digital innovation. You can't block the internet if those are incompatible ideas. You have to have people that are online, that there's confidence that internet connectivity is there. And that that the fundamental when you look at most blocks on the internet, I mean that's basically the same thing as a denial of service attack, which every other country is trying to prevent, and they're trying to prevent it because when you don't have connectivity, whether it's intermittent or long term, it has significant economic consequences for businesses that are trying to operate. They aren't able to reach their customers, they're not able to reach their partners, and vice versa. It significantly impacts their ability to collaborate. I mean, it's just across the board, significant cost and harm to the economy. And so, I think that's a fundamental issue. I think there's certain norms that have to be established that every country deals with political protest and deciding where the right lines are in terms of censorship and free speech, and every country will come up with different answers to that. But I think some of the red lines should be that doesn't involve shutting down our core infrastructure, just like you don't want to shut down the roads. For whatever reason, you say keep the roads open, but take the bad actors off the road. I think that's the same thing with the internet. There are times we're going to have content removed. There's going to be time, and that should be domestically. There's going to be times that certain services might be restricted to be operated. Certainly, any kind of illegal service or service promoting illegal activity, shutting those down, that's appropriate. But especially these, broad blocks, that's really problematic and a challenge. And something that I'm hopeful that, as policymakers just recognize the incredible, value and how much is going on in this space. That's not, just maybe this one thing they see online that, that when you shut that down, it shuts down everything. I think that's a big part of it. And that actually kind of relates to the first question, which was, why are policymakers not doing this better? And part of it is, I think, just a lack of sometimes technical expertise. On crypto specifically and SEC, I mean, as you might know, it sounds like you're probably followed the space well, right? Like, there's a longstanding fight between, CFTC, the commodities, regulator, and then the securities regulators in the United States, was basically both of them trying to decide, well, is the security or commodity, and it varies based on if it's an NFT or, a cryptocurrency, and so there's big debates about that. You could say they're philosophical debates about the nature of what these are. They're also territorial debates about who's going to kind of control the regulations, right? You see that with bureaucracies. But then there's also, I think, kind of aside from those maybe harsher critiques of these government agencies, I mean, there's also legitimate questions. They know they don't know things, and they're trying to learn, and they're trying to keep in mind that be humble regulators and ask questions and not move too fast, and not create unintended consequences, and not create more problems and not create harm. So I think that the idea of, just like doctors have the do no harm principle, I think regulators need that same principle of do no harm. And I think sometimes that means moving slow. I think sometimes it also means, though, moving out of the way. And I think, one of the things with blockchain, and in particular, and a lot of the decentralization, I mean, the point of most of that is to say, let's get rid of intermediaries. So when I hear some of the critics and the kind of the crypto community saying, well, we need regulators to do more, I'm like, well, isn't that against the entire philosophy of why you're here in the first place? Is we're saying get rid of intermediaries. So, I mean, and so then your point about like Ocean and some of these other protocols, I mean, I don't know that we need regulators to necessarily do much for those to be successful. I think their kind of limited successes due more towards, other factors, around the kind of information ecosystem and who benefits. And, I think a lot of people do have this thought that if they could monetize their data, they'd be really wealthy. And, they don't like looking at a company like maybe Facebook that makes millions off of people's data and say, well, or billions, why do they have billions of dollars and I have nothing? But if you look at, the number of users and the data, if you actually divided it up and you took all the money away from Meta and gave it to the users, well, then the users would have, a couple dollars a year and the companies would have nothing. And then we wouldn't have all this innovation. So kind of, I'm not saying that the lines are perfect there, but I don't think that just like flipping a switch necessarily solves everything either. And so, I think there are kind of those broader economic questions, market dynamic questions that we have to resolve. And I don't think it's going to be government coming in and saying, do this, this, and this, and that will fix everything. Either. I think some of this is just it's that kind of the technical innovation is really fast. The societal innovation is what's really slow. Yeah.
We will end there with the questions in the interest of time. Yeah. And I think the success of a great presentation is the amount of questions that it received. So I think it went really, really well. If everyone could please join me in a round of applause.